Ecology. Janneke did her PhD at Duke with Jim Clark, working on forest dynamics, and coming from a lab there that's really known for integrating cutting-edge quantitative approaches with field work, and that's sort of a theme that's sort of through most of the work that Janneke, or all of the work that Janneke has been involved in. She did a postdoc with Dave Tillman at Cedar Creek in Minnesota, and also with Jonathan Levine at UCSB, where she helped to develop some of the annual plant coexistence work that our lab is very grateful for being able to build on in our work. And then she was hired in 2006 at University of Washington as an assistant professor, and she's currently in a Dow chair at UW, which is fantastic. And so please join me in welcoming Janneke.
Great. All right, thank you all for coming, and especially for coming to the last seminar of what I understand has been sort of a jam-packed seminar series this quarter. So I'm really excited to share with you some of the work that my lab has been doing in the Pacific Northwest in the last 12 or 13 years. And in case I forget, there's a number of people up here, including Amy Ingert, who's at University of British Columbia, and a whole bunch of my past and current grad students and postdocs whose data that I will be showing you today. So one of the fundamental questions in community ecology is trying to gain an understanding of what structures communities, why you see the species you do and the locations you do. So if you were to consider this larger circle a location and each of these smaller circles an individual, some of the questions I'd be interested in knowing is why is it that, and the colors represent different species. Some of the questions I'd be interested in knowing is why are there only 3 different species in this local community, and why is it that the green species is more abundant than the other species? And of course, this is a question that I'm not the only community ecologist who spent a lot of time in the last 20 or 30 years thinking about this. And it's become clear that there's a lot of different factors at play. For one, we can think of where you are in the landscape regionally. So long-term evolutionary processes provide the regional species pool that's there available to kind of colonize that local community. Of course, the local environment, so climate, resources, and habitat also play an important role in filtering out some of those species. Interactions between these species can sometimes exclude or sometimes allow species to be present in locations they otherwise wouldn't be. So these are all factors that can play a really strong role in driving the community composition that we see. And of course, all these factors are important, and lots of people have been studying these different processes and trying to understand the relative importance of these different factors. But I would say it's probably about 10 or 15 years ago that these types of questions went from being somewhat academic or sort of, kind of very basic to being more applied in nature, because we as humans are influencing almost every aspect. The regional species pool, we're deleting some species, we're moving species around, we're changing local environments, and by reshuffling species, we're also changing the interactions that are out there. So I'm really interested in understanding when you take a really strong environmental change that we are responsible for, like climate change, a really strong directional driver, what is it, how does that influence the local communities that you see? And so we can take this from sort of the abstract squares and circles that I drew in PowerPoint and think a little more about actual communities. So this is a picture of my study site. This is Mount Rainier in Washington. And there's a lot of different plant species here and a lot of different communities. But basically, at low elevations, you have these really dense coniferous forests with a very lush understory. And as you go higher in elevation, you get these really beautiful, diverse alpine wildflower meadows. And the kinds of questions that I'm interested in understanding is, can we predict how climate change, which has already been occurring in this region, as in lots of other places, can we predict how climate change will reshuffle these communities? Is there a way that we can understand which of these communities are going to be particularly resilient and particularly sensitive to the effects of climate change? So what I'd like to do today is to basically tell you 3 stories or 3 vignettes about some of the ways that we in our lab have been approaching this question to try to understand how forest communities within Mount Rainier National Park, which is sort of representative of forests on the west side of the Pacific Northwest, how they may respond to climate change. And so I'm first going to talk about how forests have already responded to ongoing climate change. So one great way to try to understand what happens into the future is to try to understand what happened in the past. And these regions have already experienced 40 years of climate change, and we have access to some long-term data that allows us to ask how communities already responded. And then I'm going to talk about climate refuge and demographic inertia, which are two factors that ecologists have been thinking about a lot as factors that could influence how much change we see and potentially influence whether communities are resilient or sensitive to climate change. And I'll explain what these factors, what these terms mean when we get there. But first I want to tell you a little bit about the study system. So hopefully very non-controversial. Hopefully we are here, and this is where I work, just to put this in geographic context. Feel free to challenge me on that in the question and answer session. So I think of Mount Rainier National Park. It's obviously a beautiful place to work, very convenient. It's only a 3-hour drive from Seattle. It's very easy to recruit both graduate students and undergraduates to work out there because it's beautiful. But the reason, I mean, all those factors are great, but the main reason I work there is if you're somebody who's interested in climate change, it's very convenient to go to a place where there's a lot of climate in a small space, and mountains offer that opportunity. So by driving from the base of Mount Rainier National Park to sort of one of our highest sites while driving and walking, that covers the same amount of climate space as driving from Seattle all the way up to Anchorage, but obviously much more convenient in terms of putting down study systems. So here are some pictures which illustrate some of the unique characteristics of the study site. So at low elevations, this was a reunion of, that's actually Jim Clark, for those of you that are interested. This is a reunion of our lab group about 2 years ago. And we're standing in front of a giant western red cedar tree. So this is one of the bigger trees in the park that you can go to, but it's really not that unusual to come across trees that are 1.5 meters or so in diameter. So one of the characteristics is that the Pacific Northwest, just like Northern California, just grows really big trees. There's a lot of carbon held up in those forests, and the trees are really big. At higher elevations, you get these really beautiful, diverse alpine wildflower meadows. And then the other factor that kind of relates to why you see these sort of profusion of blooms in a very narrow window of time is climate, and in particular snow. So here is, this picture was actually taken in April. So snow lasts well into July at some of our higher elevation sites, and there's just a ton of snow that falls in these mountains. So at Paradise, Mount Rainier briefly for a year or two had the record of the most amount of snow in 1 year, and it was 22 meters that fell in 1 year. So the amount of precip, you get about 3 meters of precip at some of these sites, but it mostly falls as snow. So there's just a lot of snow. And because there's so much of it, it melts out so late. That's partly why you get these really climatically constrained growing seasons and these profusion of wildflowers. So entirely today, I'll be talking to you about the forest community, so the tree species. So here are some of the players. I think, do you guys have Douglas fir around here? Yeah, so that's probably the only one you have around here. Some of these others occur probably in Lassen and Shasta in Northern California. But these are 7 of the kind of 10 to 15 species that we work with. And part of the reason I put this slide up is just for those of you that work in the tropics or even in eastern temperate forests, these forests are not very diverse. In any one stand, you'll only have 2 to 3 species. And by studying these 7 species, you're covering about 80 to 90% of the individuals in basal area out there. So they're all conifers, and which makes them not very interesting in terms of traits, but it is a relatively not diverse community, which makes it easy to study a few species and still get an idea of what the whole community is doing. All right, so that's the study system. Let's move on to the first question, which is how have these forest communities already responded to climate change? So before I tell you a little bit about the data, I'd like to first talk you through some of the expectations that we had, or some of the ways we were thinking about how communities might respond to climate change. And we'll start with, so here is a hypothetical side of a mountain. If you imagine each of these curves represents a different species, and the location, like the abundance of a species along a climate gradient. And basically the assumption that most of us have when we see a giant elevational gradient like this is that most of the species are occurring at the elevation or the climate space that they are most tolerant to. So kind of the distribution of the species is matched to the climate. And I'm not going to show you any data. I'm not going to really spend a lot of time talking about why we believe climate constrains these range limits, or most of these range limits. But just suffice it to say that we've done a lot of different studies that illustrate that there's a strong relationship between climate and performance of the kinds we would expect to drive range limits. And this is just an example of the effects of two important climate variables on the growth of adult trees. And you can see for almost all the tree species, there's really strong positive effects of growing degree days and negative effects of snow at upper range limits. And those are the kinds of relationships we expect to see if climate is driving the range limits. Okay, so we're going to assume that species distributions are constrained by climate. And what that means for communities, so for example, if you're standing at this point on the side of the mountain and you were to survey the trees around you, you would expect your community to be made up of the species that match that climate that you're at, right? There would be some sort of correspondence. Okay, that's great, but then what happens when we jack up the temperature, right? So theoretically, we would expect, if these species are well behaved, which they're generally not, but let's just go there, we'd expect that they would all march up the mountain and follow their optimal climates. And if you were standing there for 40, 50, 100 years, you would expect to see the community around you shift in such a way to match those changes in temperature. And ecologists, just because we don't have enough jargon out there, call this thermophilization. It's basically the idea that your community, your local community, the sort of warm adapted species are increasing in abundance and the cold adapted species are losing out. So that's a pattern we'd expect to see. But of course, it's not the only, we might see other patterns. We could also see absolutely no change, right? And this could occur if the rate at which those species can march up the mountain is a lot slower than the rate at which climates change, so that's a possibility. A third possibility, of course, is that something really wacky happens that's entirely unrelated to climate, and we have some sort of reassembly of communities and combinations of which we haven't seen before. So this is definitely possible, but I will not be talking about that possibility so much at all today, although it's something we're interested in exploring in the future. So mostly we're interested in trying to understand whether these communities, these forest communities, thermophilize, and if they do thermophilize, whether they're shifting at the rate at which we would expect, given the amount of climate change we've seen. Okay, so what kind of data do we need? What we want to have is measures of community composition before and after some sort of warming event. And really, fortunately, because I'm working in a national park where there's been a long history of data collection, I actually have access to this kind of data. So back in 1970, between 1976 and 1978, the National Park Service at Mount Rainier National Park put out about 500 meter square plots where they measured the composition both of the trees as well as the understory in lots of different, lots of different places and across a huge climate gradient. They also, fortunately, which is not a given back in the late 70s, they preserved it in such a way that they were able to send it to me in an Excel spreadsheet about 10 years ago. So Jerry Franklin and Catherine Kopas were very generous in sharing that data with us. So what we've been doing, Amy Anger's group and I, in the last 4 years or so, we've been going, well, when I say we, I mean the royal we, these are undergraduates that I've hired. They've been going back to some of these locations and collecting as many of the locations as we can and collecting exactly the same kind of data to try to understand how these communities have changed. So the other thing we have community before and after, but we also need to know something about the climate, right? Like both before and after. And for that, we turn to a couple of different sources. We have information, sort of downscaled climate information from Oregon State University, the PRISM site. And so here's some maps of mean annual temperature, winter precipitation, and summer precipitation as predicted for currently. We can also turn to global circulation models to understand how much climate has changed in the last 40 years. So this gives us community composition and climate. So let me spend just a little time talking about the statistics. So what we really, I think I should be standing here. What we really want is we want some sort of statistical technique that relates climate to communities. And in fact, and so what we used is something called a joint species distribution model. It operates a lot, for those of you who are familiar with species distribution models, it operates a lot like a species distribution model, except it's across multiple species. And I specifically put a black box here because I'm not going to go into the statistical details, but I'm more than happy to talk about them if people are interested. And these models are fit in a Bayesian context, which is really convenient because in addition to quantifying the relationship between climate and communities, because it's fit in a Bayesian context, you can also use a given community composition to predict back at you what the climate should have been given another model. So the first step is we quantify the relationship between climate and community composition, and then we take that model from one time period, in this case from 2015, and we apply it to the previous time step, 1978, to predict the composition, to predict what is the climate that is felt by the community at that time, based on the 2015 relationship. What we can then do is we can take the actual climate in 2015 at that location and look at the change from what the community felt in 1978 to what the actual climate is in 2015 to essentially get a sense of how much turnover would this model predict and how much thermophilization has occurred. Another way to think of this is if you were standing at one location in 1978 and you looked at the community around you and knew what the relationship with temperature was, if somebody were to say in 40 years it's going to be this degree warmer and you had to predict where is this community going to be, you would just walk uphill or downhill that amount of warming. Right? So this is a way of quantifying that relationship. Okay, so before I show you some results, I'm going to show you a few figures just to show you that this isn't a totally crazy thing to do, that these models actually work pretty well. So on the left-hand side is for four of our 12 species is essentially how well this model predicts the presence and absence relative to the actual presence and absence. So on the x-axis are each of these plots has, for the different species, has a bar on the left, which is for all plots in which the species was absent, and a bar on the right, which is for all plots in which species are present. And on the y-axis is what the model predicts in terms of presence-absence. And the main thing to take away from this is that the model does a really good job of predicting a low probability of presence in plots where the species is actually absent, and a high probability of presence in which the species is actually present. So that's good. It does a good job of that. The other thing you can do is you can take the model and predict what the climate is and line that up to the observed climate and actually ask how tight of a relationship. Just by knowing the composition of the community, how well could you do at predicting what the climate is? I'm only showing you this for mean annual temperature. You could do this for all the other climatic variables as well, but this is the kind of R that ecologists very rarely get. It makes me wonder why we even bother putting out climate stations. Maybe we should just go out and measure tree communities instead. But as you can see, the relationship between predicted and observed climate is really strong. So that just says that there's a tight correlation between climate and community composition. So this is not a crazy thing to do. All right, but what we really wanted to know is how much these communities have thermophilized. And here's what I'm showing you is a histogram of those results. So this is basically on the, so it's a histogram showing you a frequency distribution across all those plots of the degree of thermophilization in degrees Celsius. And this arrow is pointing at the mean, which is 0.1 degrees Celsius. So two things you probably notice. A is that there's a huge amount of spread, and we can talk about why that might be. But the second thing is that, yes, the average has actually shifted towards warmer communities, which suggests that these communities have thermophilized as we might expected. So warm adapted species at any one location have increased in abundance, and cold adapted species have decreased. However, what I didn't tell you is how much warming had been experienced in the Pacific Northwest. Here's a graph. This is downscaled by the Climate Impacts Group at University of Washington, showing the change in temperature since 1900. If you kind of extrapolate over, if you estimate how much warming has occurred between 1978, which is when these plots were first measured, and 2015, what you get is a range of about 0.2 to 0.5 degrees Celsius, about 0.35 degrees Celsius, and you can see that that's a lot more warming than the amount of thermophilization we saw. So in other words, we have seen shifts in community composition that are in the direction we would expect with climate change, the thermophilization, but it hasn't been as much as the amount of warming that we saw in the region. So I want to step back a bit and sort of think about why that might be, because there's a couple of different possibilities. Like why, so we've seen thermophilization, but it hasn't been as much as we'd expected. There's kind of two, there may be others, but there's two main reasons we could think of. And one, we used our expectation of 0.35 degrees Celsius was based on these downscaled climate models that were done in all of the Pacific Northwest. So like kind of a large range. I mean, Mount Rainier is just a very, very tiny point in there. So maybe our expectations of how much thermophilization we should have seen, which was based on how much warming, maybe that's wrong. Maybe there's been less warming at Mount Rainier National Park or in some of the sites we're looking at. And that you could almost interpret that as kind of good news, right? Like maybe that suggests some sort of resilience in these communities. On the other hand, it's also possible that these communities just aren't shifting as fast as climate is warming, and given that these are long-lived old trees, that seems like a pretty reasonable assumption as well, that maybe they just can't keep up with climate change. And this is probably bad news, right? So I think one lesson that I've had is that seeing no changes, seeing less change than you would expect in response to an anthropogenic driver like climate change, I think it's tempting to interpret that as good news, but it doesn't necessarily always mean good news. It could mean postponed bad news, I guess. So what I'd like to do next is basically talk through these two possibilities. One is the possibility that our expectation of warming was wrong. In that case, maybe climate refugia at Mount Rainier National Park have contributed to the slower than expected community shifts. The other option is that these forests just are not able to respond particularly fast. So maybe demographic inertia, so sort of the inertia in the system due to slow population dynamics, are not allowing these communities shift particularly fast. So I'm going to start with the idea of climatic refugia. So basically, the idea would be that we've seen about 1/3 of a degree Celsius warming kind of in the region, but only like say 1/3 of that at Mount Rainier National Park. So less warming in some areas than others. And that may seem totally crazy, but just to remind you all that the Arctic is warming a lot faster than other parts of the world, right? So maybe we're seeing this as a smaller scale as well. So that's point one. And point two is that there are actually a bunch of features in mountains like Mount Rainier National Park that are suggestive of this potential of slower than expected warming. So one, when you have a lot of topography, you have what are called these cold air, thermal inversions and cold air pools. So for example, if you were under this cloud cover and were to measure temperature for a couple days or something, or a couple of hours, and were to measure it up on this ridge, even though you're at higher elevation here and you tend to think of going up being colder, it would probably be warmer there and you'd see more extremes than you would in these valley bottoms. So lots of complex topography can lead to a lot of these cold air pools. And the other thing that's possible is these really dense canopies really do moderate, buffer like the forest floor from some of these extremes in climate. If you were walking around in the forest here, it'd be a lot warmer and you'd see more extremes than you would under this dense canopy. And of course for these forests, like the change that occurs, not in terms of mortality, but in terms of recruitment, like everything has to come up under through this dense canopy. So maybe these features are moderating the climate. So we set out to test this. And it turns out we actually didn't set this up, well, we didn't plan to have the data to test this, but it turns out that if you're interested in climate change, and all your graduate students are as well, and you have access to these really cheap hobo pendant loggers that measure temperature constantly, so we basically have now 10 years, although at the time we only used 7 years of temperature data. So these dots here are all places where we've instrumented and put like temperature sensors all across the park. Like I said, it doesn't look like any rhyme or reason because they're mostly just study sites that my grad students put up. And we basically have 7 years of temperature data from all these different locations. We also have a LiDAR map, so we have really good information at each of these locations on how dense the canopy is and what the topography is. So are you in kind of in a concavity or a convexity? And what we can do is we can take the temperature records from each of those locations and compare it to regional climate on a daily basis and ask, when we look at daily variation in regional climate and local and variation at each of these locations, is the slope of that relationship less than 1, which suggests that if it is, it suggests that these locations are buffered from extremes in climate. We can also look at whether it's greater than 1, which suggests that it's more exposed, or haven't come up with a good term for the opposite of that. And then because because we have information on both what the topography and the canopy density is, we can also ask whether the slope of this line is affected by both those things. And so that's what a graduate student of mine, Ian Breckheimer, did. So let me just walk you through both of these graphs. So what is on the x-axis on this panel on the left is something called a cold air index, which it's just a way of quantifying like whether you're in a concavity or a convexity. And so if you're on the left-hand side of the graph, you're on a ridge, and if you're on the right-hand side of the graph, you're in a cove. Here is canopy volume in meters squared. And elevation turned out to be an important explanatory variable, so that's on the y-axis. And the shades here represent whether the slope of that line between regional and local climate, whether it's less than 1, which is buffering, so blue, those are the blues, or greater than 1, those are the reds. And the crosses represent where those relationships are significantly different from 1. So the main thing to take away from this is that, yes, if you're in a cove, or if you're in a dense canopy, you are, at Mount Rainier National Park, buffered from these extremes in climate. I do want to point out that the amount of buffering, 0.8, so that implies if you had a 0.35 degree Celsius warming in the last 40 years, that whatever 0.8 times, well, I can 0.8 times 3, let's go with 0.24, that's still more than the amount of thermophilization we found. So it doesn't seem like it's sufficient to explain maybe it explains part of it, but it doesn't seem like it's sufficient to explain the slow community shifts. And it would only explain them if all of our plots are located in some of these cooler areas, right? And the plots were distributed all across Mount Rainier National Park. So the next thing we did is Ian built a model to predict the amount of buffering at each of these plot locations, because we were really interested to look at the relationship between them, because we thought maybe that would explain that huge amount of variation in thermophilization. And what we found was super puzzling. So if you look at the locations that are predicted to be buffered from regional climates and those that are exposed, and you plot like the amount of thermophilization in those plots, what you would have predicted is that there's a positive relationship. So the areas that are buffered, you would expect to see less community shifts, less thermophilization than the areas that are exposed. And in fact, we found the exact opposite relationship, which was and still is a bit of a head scratcher. The main potential explanation we've come up with, and it helps to look at a map of where we see those buffered locations being. They're primarily at low elevations in the western part of the park, which experiences less moisture stress. And so in these warm, moist environments at lower elevations, we tend to see higher demographic rates. So it could just be that turnover is faster in these locations. Maybe these locations are experiencing faster gain and loss of species. All right, so where does that leave us with thinking about climate refugia? I mean, they're in the news a lot as potential places we should think about in terms of preserving species. I would say, for sure, we found a lot of microclimate variability in locations that really vary at a fine spatial scale in terms of buffering, hot spots, cold spots, driven by topography and canopy. So far, it really doesn't seem like our sites, like this, that it's buffering these forest communities from shifts in community composition. And partly this is because all those features that drive variability in microclimate may also independently influence community structure in the first place. I will say one thing I forgot to mention for the forest communities we're looking at is that the turnover, the forest communities are in terms of presence and absence of trees that have a diameter at breast height, so that are bigger than this. And a lot of our seedlings are really, really small, so it could be that it's not explaining turnover in that sense, but it could play a much more important role for understory communities, and that's both in terms of plant species, they're perennial as well, but maybe they have faster generation times, but also in terms of insects or small mammal, basically communities that stick around in the understory. Okay, so microclimate refugia doesn't explain the slower than expected community shifts that we saw. So the next possibility we turn to is that maybe it's about demographic inertia, really slow rates of responses of these communities. So for that, we sort of have to step back, and rather than thinking at the community scale, we have to think about how do communities shift. It happens if individual species shift their ranges, right? So if you take, for example, this hypothetical species that has a climatically suitable space that it occurs in, and we imagine climate change shifts that climatically suitable space. Really, the only way for this species, if it's a plant species, this is different for animals, the only way for this species to shift its range is for individuals to die at the trailing edge and to recruit at the leading edge. And there's lots of reasons to think that those processes might lag the rate of climate change, right? So for example, at the trailing edge, recruitment and dispersal limitation could really slow the rates at which these species colonize new habitat. Of course, I initially drew this as one species just racing across the landscape without any, without any competitor. But of course, the competitors, resident competitors, could really competitive interactions could really slow these rates of responses. And of course, at the trailing edge, like all those trees have to die before your range has contracted. And if these rates are, if any of these processes is really slow for all the component species, then community shifts are going to lag. The rates of warming. So we're basically going to walk through these possibilities to show you, to ask whether is recruitment limited, is competition high, and is death slow. And for that, we turn to a different set of data, which frankly I also have, I also inherited. So we have been lucky enough to inherit data from 15 1-hectare permanent forest stands. These were set up in 1978. Here's like a cutout from the original stem maps, which were hand drawn. And we've been doing seedling censuses, and each of these numbers here just correspond to the elevation. We've been doing seedling censuses. Here's a picture of what that really large western red cedar I showed you. It started out being this big, so that's something interesting to think about. And these sites have been revisited for 8 years. So we have 8 censuses since 1978. So 40 years of data on growth and survival. And because the plots, the stems are mapped, we can look at growth as a function of the neighbors around it. So basically, what we can do, because these plots cover really large elevational gradient, we can ask: is recruitment for our focal species limited at the leading range edges? Does competition slow down growth and potentially slow down population dynamics? And is mortality really slow at the trailing range edges of all these species? So let me just show you some of the data for that. Okay, so this is for just 4 of our focal species, but the patterns are pretty much the same. And what this is based on 7, I think, years of seedling censuses. What it shows you is for each of these focal species, the density of seeds per meter squared in the core of their ranges versus at and beyond their range edges. So the there's 2 things to take away from this. For all of the species, the density of seedlings, and these are these little germinants, these little 1-year-olds, so most of these are going to die anyway, just to keep in mind. You can see that the density of seedlings at the edges and beyond is much lower than it is at the core, which is not that surprising. That's what we would expect. The other thing to notice is if you look at the scale on the y-axis, like these numbers are really, this is numbers per meter squared. These numbers are not very high. Only western hemlock gets more than 10 germinants per meter squared. The other thing, I'm not going to show you that data, but the other thing to note is that these germinants take at least 100, if not 120 years to get to the point where they themselves can produce seeds and move that invasion front forward. So there's every reason to believe that essentially processes at the leading edges are really slow, right? Okay, let's turn to potential effects of competitive interactions. So what I'm showing you here through a bunch of models that incorporate size that I don't really have time to explain is essentially the proportion of growth for each of these species that's lost to competition. And what does that mean? What that means is if we took these neighborhood models and we predicted the effect of neighborhood density on the growth of individual species, and then we use those models to predict how much growth would there be if you took away all neighbors. And that's essentially how much growth is lost to competition. competition. And you can see that anywhere between 5 to up to 25% of the growth that an individual tree species might experience is lost because of competitive interactions. And so these are the kind of what that means is that these competitive interactions could slow the rate of population dynamics and really prevent species from invading and displacing residents. Finally, let's talk about processes that happen at the trailing edge. So what we did here is we took these 40 years of information of these tagged trees, and we looked at mortality rates at the trailing edges of these species ranges. So what I'm showing you here for 6 of the focal species is the annual survival rate. Well, I guess if you want to know what the species are, they're on the bottom here. But the main thing to keep, and it ranges anywhere from about 0.982 all the way to 0.995. So the main thing to think about is that the numbers on the y-axis here in terms of annual survival rates are really, really high. So to put that into context, if we take this species here, silver fir, which has the lowest survival rate, if you take a population of, say, 50 individuals and apply this survival rate to it, it would take about 40 years to lose half of the population has a half-life of 40 years. And so that just means it's going to take a really long time for these adult trees to die once climate becomes unsuitable. So hopefully what I've shown you is that in terms of fecundity or reproduction and growth and survival, there's every reason to believe that the dynamics of the population dynamics of these tree species is really slow, and that they may not be able to keep up in terms of demographically, in terms of the rates of climate change. Of course, what we really want to do is we want to put all that information together into a population dynamics model, and this is somewhat preliminary, but what we've done is we've put some of this information for one of our tree species, Pacific silver fir, together into an integro projection model. And this is just to remind me to tell you that it's an integro projection model. It's essentially, it's like a matrix model, except that you use something like size as a continuous variable that affects fecundity, growth, and survival. So we've fit a lot of hierarchical Bayesian. It's very painful, and we're still not out of the woods yet. But essentially, what we've done is for one of our species, we've been able to look at lambdas. We've been able to calculate population growth rates across the range of the species to get a sense of how do these different processes combine, what kinds of population growth rates do we have. And here's what there's confidence intervals around here because they're based on, basically from the MCMC samplers, they're based on hierarchical Bayesian models. So what I'm showing you here is for Pacific silver fir across its elevational range, 6 of the stands it's in, is an estimate of population growth rates. And there's sort of 2 things to take away from this. The first thing is that you actually see what may be a signature of climate change, where there seems to have slightly higher population growth rates towards its upper range. But the main thing, again, if you look at the y-axis here, like a lambda of 1.01 or 1.015, for those of you who are demographers, you know that that's a really low population growth rate. And that's not particularly surprising because these are really slow-growing, long-lived trees. But one of the things we'd like to do in the future is to essentially take these population dynamics models, put in things like climate sensitivities, which we don't have in there now, and competitive interactions to try to start playing games, sort of virtual games on the computer to try to understand a little better on what's constraining population growth in different parts of the range. Okay, so I think the upshot here is that we really think that demographic inertia, or these really slow population dynamics, are primarily what's driving the slow rates of community shifts that we've seen in these forest communities. I think it's reasonable to ask, is this what's going to happen in the future? And I think probably, but the one giant caveat, what none of these models contain, or none of these estimates contain, because none of our sites have experienced any of these kinds of disturbances, is the effects of disturbance. So things like the mountain pine beetle in the Rocky Intermountain West, or large-scale fires, are the kinds of disturbances we also expect to be increased by climate change, and there's nothing to cause your community to rapidly disassemble and reassemble, or a range limit to really rapidly contract a disturbance like this could really rapidly do that. The thing about sort of western, forests sort of on the wet side of the Pacific Northwest is fire is really important. All the stands I work in, all the forest stands, they were all initiated by a fire, but the fire frequencies are really low, 300 to 400 years. And of course, the fire frequencies could really increase with climate change and really change the equation in complicated ways. So, will demographic inertia continue to slow tree community shifts? I think in the short term, it's really likely because these adult trees are really so slow to die. Again, with a caveat, unless disturbance comes along. I think in the long term, at some point, climate changes in temperature and soil moisture and climate moisture deficit will eventually cause some of these demographic rates. They're often nonlinear with climate, so we expect at some point these demographic rates to cross some sort of thresholds, and those lambdas, those population dynamics, to really cause the population to disappear. And of course, as I was just mentioning, large-scale disturbance throws a wrench into that adds a lot of unknowns that we're not really sure about. Okay, so what I'd like to end with just, this is just a small amount of the research we've been doing in my lab, and so I just wanted to end by telling you what we're working on, what we're continuing to work on now, both in terms of this question of how climate change will affect whole communities and shift communities, as well as some other projects. So what I talked about today is entirely how forest communities has shifted in response to warming, but we nicely have data, so that's about 20 of the species in our data set, but there's the whole understory community, which adds another 200 or so species, and what we really want to do is add information on these other species and start to ask how have the whole communities shifted in response to climate change. One of the reasons we haven't done it yet, as you might imagine, on a modeling side of things, when you go from 20 to 200 species, the models are very slow to converge. But I think it'll be really interesting because we have Pacific Northwest has a lot of ferns, so there's a lot of fern species, there's a lot of herbs, there's a lot of shrubs. Sort of the trait question starts becoming more interesting because you actually have some differences. All the conifer trees have pretty similar traits, but when you start looking at the understory species, you have a lot of differences in traits that might be interesting to explore. Another thing we're trying to test experimentally, we have a pretty large seed addition experiment because we're trying specifically to pin down to what extent recruitment limitation and the interaction between where recruitment occurs and some of these microclimate, some of these hot versus cold spots. This may look like a sea of toothpicks to you, but each of these toothpicks is marking a seedling of that germinated from a seed that we added there. So we have for about 30 species, we have thrown around in a very carefully controlled way across something like 540 plots. We've added seeds to across a large climate gradient. And so we're monitoring the germination and survival of those seedlings to get a better handle on how recruitment limitation influences could play a role in constraining those communities. And finally, I don't really want to say that we were lucky, but about 2 years ago there was, so fires on the wet side of the Cascades are pretty unusual because the fire frequency is really low. But back in 2017, that's Mount Rainier over there, really close to our study sites, there was a fairly large extensive fire. And so one of the things we want to do this summer is we want to go back to some of these areas and monitor what kinds of communities are starting to reassemble there in terms of the germinants and the early seedlings, to get a sense of whether disturbances like these, it's likely to be pretty hot, I would assume, in there. And it's possible that these, I don't know why we thought community shifts would happen sort of slowly, and there maybe some of these community shifts are really jump-started by disturbance, and this offers the opportunity to maybe start to test some of those questions. So some other questions we remain in the lab really interested in is less at the community level, but more at the species level. We're really interested in how climatic constraints and species interactions, not just on trees, but also on herbs, interact to influence demography and drive range limits. And as I said, we're trying to pull some of that data for trees together into these population models to try to better understand that. The other thing I've gotten interested in most recently is thinking about how whole interaction networks, for example, between tree seeds and their predators, can get rewired by climate change and what impacts that might have on both parties. I also, for those of you who are interested in phenology, have a long-standing interest in wildflower phenology. So we've been monitoring the timing. So this is, of course, what everybody wants to see when they come to Mount Rainier National Park. And as I said, like the snow doesn't melt until mid-July or so, and it comes back in October. So that's one of the reasons you get this profusion of beautiful colors at the same time. But it turns out that there's actually quite a bit of variability as to when this flowering occurs, and it's really tightly, which is not so surprising, really tightly tied to the date of snowmelt. So here's the relationship between peak flowering of one of our focal species and the date of snowmelt at a particular location. And these triangles in orange are marked because 2015 was the warmest, driest year on record. So this is just to show usually a peak wildflower season is around there, but in the future we might expect it to be as early as May. And one of the ways, actually, this data was all collected by an army of about, each year, 150 volunteers collect data on wildflower phenology. This is Mary Marsh, who's using one of our pamphlets to note phenology for us. We have about 40,000 rows of data, which is really exciting for us as scientists. But on the flip side, one of the reasons we wanted to set this up as a citizen science program is become increasingly interested to try to understand how we can get more people concerned about climate change and whether citizen science is a way to get more people sort of believing in the value of science and maybe understanding some of the impacts that are out there. So anybody who's interested in citizen science, I'd love to talk to you. And with that, lots of people to thank. This is Alec Baird up there, who was in my lab until he came, as an undergraduate, until he came here. So these are various people who've helped, who have been in the lab and helped collect data over the years. And with that, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.
I have two. The first one is about the competitive interactions. So if the climate is shifting and the communities are so to some extent, do you not expect the competitors to be affected as well?
Yeah, so that's one of the things we haven't done yet, but trying to understand how the strength of competition and also how so there's the species have really different distributions. So it's possible that the higher elevation species are more frost tolerant but poorer competitors. So trying to understand some of those dynamics. So that's not in any of the estimates I showed you. This was just like number of competitors regardless of species. One of the things, this is actually, I was talking to Nathan about this last week. I have a grad student who wants to quantify these pairwise interactions in all these different locations, and hopefully with that we can start to understand the nature of these pairwise interactions and whether they themselves vary with climate. But yes, I mean it's probably going to be more complex than we think it is, because it always is. But I think there's a good reasons to believe that these might also vary with climate. Yeah, and that would be super interesting to look into. Great question.
Can I ask
I don't know. It's fine by me.
So the other thing I asked was a larger, broader question about is it possible to compare your findings with, say, like what's happening to the broadleaf forest? Does somewhere else, say on the East Coast, does anyone have kinds of data that a longer mountainside or just could be?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think there are differences. I mean, I guess, so there are other people who have resurrected sort of, Sue Harrison and Ellen Damshin, and there's a bunch of people in Europe. So I think the finding of lagged, like thermophilization, but lags is, some places the change seems to be just as fast, but it's not that unusual to find lagged changes, especially in forests, which in the end is not that surprising. I imagine the nuances are different, but I think that's probably a commonality, that we shouldn't necessarily expect every place to be changing as fast as we expect, but by the same token, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not sensitive. So I would put my money on that is a generality we can make. All right, yeah.
Yeah, I have another really broad, sort of big picture question. So I'll just preface it by saying that, I ask it with a lot of humility, because I've tried to do similar work that you do, so keep that in mind, that I don't do as good a job as you. But I feel like I've been in, I was an undergrad in 2001, hearing about this. I think there was landmark papers that showed that species were moving up, moving north, tracking temperatures with climate change. basically 20 years ago, and you know, the paleo data shows the same thing. So our expectation is that species track climate, especially temperature. And I think, you know, from the beginning we kind of knew, yeah, there's going to be lags. That makes perfect sense. There's less of a lag in the ocean, which is, I think, is a pretty significant finding. More of a lag in a lot of terrestrial environments. And then we also know that, you know, competitors are going to modulate things, right?
Yeah.
But it becomes idiosyncratic. And so, given that, and do you feel like we've really had any significant surprises in the past 20 years? Or is that kind of, has this work sort of been confirmatory, and not in a bad way, but going forward, the next generation of ecologists, do we keep doing this refinement of these models, or would we do something else?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, obviously what we all, I think, love to come up with from a you know, communicating our science to a, you know, like in a predictive sense to those wanting to know is like some sort of predictive framework that is generalizable. I guess I would say in general we see the shifts in the direction we're expecting, but I think it's a really good question. We haven't had a huge amount of luck with traits predict. I mean, as you probably know, I guess I don't really know if we're gonna find those kinds of generalities that will, like, I struggle with that myself. So the longer I work in this system, the less I am comfortable. So my national park colleagues, like they would love to, you know, like the longer I work there, less comfortable I am giving them maps of like, this is what's going to happen in 40 years, because I just feel like I have no idea. I feel more comfortable with these kinds of generalities, right? There's some other, I didn't talk about this today, but actually some other generalities that, where, I mean, it seems really slow, but I do think there are proving to be some useful tidbits. So one of the things in these alpine systems, for example, when you go up even higher in elevation, soil gets really crappy. So one of the things that I feel reasonably comfortable saying is that even though trees are going to be slow, they're going to invade meadows faster than meadows are going to invade upwards, because there's no soil there, and soil development is even slower than tree expansion. So I do think we're coming in on the kinds of generalities that are helpful in terms of management. Yeah, I know that's not very hopeful, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I mean, that's a good answer, and I think the word's really important. I just think, you know, it becomes tough to talk about anything past 20 years, because obviously policy technology is going to play a huge role. We can do a great job predicting how the species respond to temperature, but if we don't know actually how much temperature is going to respond, or how much, you know, we can
but to be honest, my experience in the national park system has been, and this is not a criticism of the national park system, because like any big bureaucratic agency, they're slow moving, and you know, I think they're experiencing a crisis in their whole mission of preserving things the way they are. You know, to be honest, the management really lags the science. So I do feel like I could help them improve their management without knowing all the fine details. Yeah.
I guess I wanted to ask how is the management using your findings? Like, do you suggest like helping that movement?
I mean, they actually, so that's interesting. That's I don't think that they'll do that. They actually have in the past. They've removed trees from the meadows, but that's primarily because the Paradise Visitor Center is built at this place that you can walk out of the inn and into the wildflower meadows, and the trees were kind of messing that up. So that's some management that I don't know that they would be allowed to do that today. I honestly, I think in the next 10 years, I hope that there'll be some changes, because I think. I mean, Glacier National Park is not going to have a glacier, and Joshua National, like there's not going to be Joshua trees. I think the Park Service has to change, but I think unfortunately at the wider level, they're stuck kind of with this mandate to preserve things. So one of the ways they have been using like the wildflower phenology stuff, like trying to understand when peak wildflower season is, like that actually turns out to be really highly matched to when people come and visit. So that's actually been something that they've been in some ways not most excited about, but that's most like directly applicable to changes they might make in management, like just even hiring seasonal workers. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. The following question was motivated by knowledge gained from the LA Times.
Okay. Is that good or bad?
It's very superficial. But if you look at the forests, the coniferous forests in Colorado and places like that,
yeah.
what you do is you get significant drying, not enough rain, So the tree dries out, so it can't mobilize as much energy to produce secondary chemistry, and the result is the bark beetles move
Yep.
in and they wipe out the forest.
Yep.
Do you see anything? Do you see any herbivore effects?
No, I mean,
of that kind or any other kind?
no, I mean, I would say the western, so this is a much wetter place, right?
Yeah.
So we haven't, in the western part of Washington and also British Columbia, we haven't seen any major insect, pest, fungi, whatever. We haven't seen any major outbreaks like that. I don't feel like that means that there aren't going to be such outbreaks in the future, but not so far. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think you showed us a histogram of how the democratization happened. It had significant spread.
Yeah.
And I think you talked a little bit about how these different factors might be contributing to that variation. I was wondering, I'm not familiar with the structure of your data, so I'm not sure if this is a question that can actually be asked, but I was wondering if, because you know the composition then and now, does that initial state give either in terms of species composition or the abundances or like maybe the stage size structure of that initial state, does that have any effect?
Yeah, so far, I think I forgot to say this, so thanks for asking that question. So far, we've just fit the models in terms of presence-absence, which is actually quite coarse. We actually have the size distribution of the trees as well, and you might imagine that you would see, like, like on the colonization side, you would see, like more stuff happening at the smaller stages and more action in terms of species disappearing. So those models are actually set up that you can include size. So that's another thing we need to do. And for sure, I think that is more information that might narrow things, like that might provide more information as well. Like there was did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question, and I might have missed some of the subtlety when you're presenting results from your integrated projection model. But we see these demographic lags are either shown in the adult mortality, and I'm wondering if we look at a different demographic transition, like seedling survival, if there's less of them than there should there.
Yeah, so seedling, I mean, for sure, the seedlings, for anybody who's worked on seedlings, the best thing, they die a lot, right? Yes, so they die very rapidly. Yes, there's also a lot of them. It's a little harder to know whether that's, so yes, but in a way, because in terms of range expansion, you expect that to happen through seeds and then seedlings growing up and germinating. It's actually in the wrong direction, right? Like in order for that process to happen fast, you want the seeds and seedlings to survive and grow up. Of course, it doesn't really, and that's one of the reasons we want to put these together in population dynamic models, because really you want to know what the whole population is doing to know whether they're growing or shrinking. And also, I didn't mention this, but it would be we need to get some information on dispersal in there as well, on the range expansion side.
Great. Please join me. Thank you.